thank you all so much for being here. Just the way we're working today is that for the first part of it, I believe from 1 to 3, it's introductions and talking with our guests today. But then for the next hour, feel free to ask questions, thoughts, share anything that you'd like to. And again, if you have questions that you'd like to ask but don't want to share publicly, you can always send them to Heidi or myself. So let's begin. Today's theme, if you will, is celebrating resilience in the AAPI community. In order to acknowledge resilience, we must empathize and acknowledge the hardships that led up to that resilience. So my question that I want to pose is, what are some of the things that you've had to work through, struggle through before and after? Like, how did things shift after the incident that happened this past month? And what kind of work do you find yourself moving into, whether it's internally or externally? Whoever would like to take that.
Sure. I mean, I'll start here. I like the way you pose that as a starter. Talking about resilience, you do have to talk about what you're what you're rebounding from, right? And prior to current events and the activism that's been happening, I'll just talk about artistically. Like, I've been in Atlanta for a very long time, and I was one of the very first actresses to be in equity regionally of Indian descent. And about 10, 12 years ago, I don't want to say, there was a major regional theater, the local theater in Atlanta, that was casting 80 Days Around the World. And my friend went to go audition for it. And he comes back and he goes, "Hey, how come I didn't see you there? You're like the only Indian actress in town right now." And I was like, I don't know. I didn't even know what was going on. It was a non-equity show. So I was like, well, maybe, they don't have a lot of equity contracts. And he himself was equity. I was like, maybe they're holding it. That happens a lot. They hold it for, there's a majority of men or fewer men in equity. So you tend to get that way versus the large amount of non-equity actresses. So I was like, I don't know, whatever. Then they cast a very, very redheaded woman, a very pale Irish descended woman in the role. And if anyone knows the role, for the most part, she plays an Indian princess in that, an Asian Indian princess in that role. And I have never worked for this company, and I don't think I ever will. Just that left a really sour taste. And I have auditioned for them, and they've done a lot of good work, and we've worked with them in the past. But I just was like, you realize how unoriginal that was, how much you didn't even try to find an Asian artist. So in terms of being seen is what I think for me is happening right now. Unfortunately, we're being seen because of a tragic event. And now, the number of panels, the number of conversations that I've been able to have for the last week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks are great, but it's exhausting because I feel like I have to justify my non-violent, non-activist presence in Atlanta sometimes. Like, no, yeah, these are deep, deep, deep issues. Have they affected me for most of my life? No, I haven't felt outright racism, mostly because I am a confrontationalist, and I will be like, hold up, that's not right. You're not right. If you're in front of me, I may not go find you if you've done something racist. Like, I never really confronted these artistic directors because they didn't involve me in that conversation, and I didn't feel like I needed to educate them. That wasn't what my job was at that time. My job was a new actress, just get as much work as I can. But I was like, well, I'm not getting called in by you. If you call me in, I might mention this, but you're not calling me in, so I don't have to have a conversation with you. And now I find that I'm willing to be sought out. I'm willing to seek out these people now. And I'm willing to say, hey, what you did, not so good, not so good. Try harder. And we're making it so easy for you to try to not even try that hard. We're here. I mean, look at this group of people in this room. How many of us are artists and how many of us are Asian? That's just amazing. We're here. all you have to do is say, hey, are you there? Yes.
I think it's crazy on me that, like, even when an opportunity comes about where it specifically calls for something that you identify with, like for example, a role that calls for an Asian character, we still have to fight hard for that. And just this general blanket idea too. So which does filter into the arts, of course, but this idea that Asians or Asian Americans are not Americans, this idea of us being othered more so. And I think some of my peers here have been in a conversation with me recently where we were talking about the term even xenophobia. And you're seeing that in the media as well, in the news, and this difference of that because it's a fear of someone foreign, excuse me, or someone from another country. So this distinction of Asians in America specifically aren't usually your go-to poster board image of who is an American. And therefore, that whole deep-rooted question of where are you from and all of that when it comes to even casting for a show, film, whatever, when it asks for a broad or generic open ethnicity role, but you'll almost never see an Asian person take in that. Um, you, it just filters into so many aspects of our lives that I think we're now starting to evaluate closer. Um, and it's a bittersweet thing. I'm glad that we're challenging ourselves finally to do that, but it's also like exhausting. But it's, for me at least, it was a good check-in period of checking my privilege too, because some people have also had to deal with this their whole lives, and some people are having to deal with it more recently. And it doesn't have to be an oppression Olympics. It's this cognizant kind of awareness that we're able to share and build these bridges with each other.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say that I, like, for the most part, I also kind of isolated myself from the conversation up until recently because I was lucky enough, and everybody has got their blind spots, right? You're going to do good and and I acknowledge that. There's some things that we do that are great, and maybe you don't, or maybe, in casting or in activism, we center blackness, or we center Asian, or we center whiteness, whatever we're centering at the time. I don't think it's all or nothing. I think people have some good intentions, especially in the artistic community in Atlanta. But I was lucky, I got into the Atlanta Shakespeare Company's ensemble, and yeah, for a long time, I might have been the only diversity on that stage, but it was never a question of, oh, we're casting her as, if she's going to be Juliet, then we have to find a brown Lord and Lady Capulet. Like, there was never that question. It was just, she's the best person for this, and we're just going to cast around, the best people for each thing. And which often led to, there's not that many Asian Indian descended actors, Shakespearean actors. So, it's like, it was never a question. And I was never made to feel as though that was what I was there for. It was not tokenism, in my opinion. And the audiences did not react differently, which is so different from when you cast a Black actor in these roles. The audience expectation is so different. And because it's so different, I never really thought about being Asian as a privilege. I never thought that was giving me some sort of cover. And I don't know if it is. That's a question for anyone here. I don't know if that was giving me cover, or if there is a different reaction. And up now, realize, there is this very deep thread of xenophobia running through American society that is not just Black and white, which is something that we've talked about as members of East by Southeast and just as friends. But it's really been eye-opening in thinking of what it was prior to this was my experience, what it was prior to today, or in this zeitgeist of being aware of Asian Americans. Because, I never really thought of it before. I never really thought of it as anything other than I'm just being an actor, or I'm just being an artist, or I'm just being human. And up until now, you would be hard pressed up until the events of recent things, you would be hard pressed to find me describe myself as anything other than American. When people would ask me where I'm from, I was born in New Jersey. I have very little tie, not very little ties, but culturally speaking, my family, we we had more of a nuclear family than an traditional Indian family. I didn't grow up near my cousins. We moved around a lot. My parents were divorced. So for a long time, we were just dealing with human issues that had nothing to do with culture. So I wasn't indoctrinated in a culture. My mom, as an Indian mom, hates cooking. So when she was growing up, her aunt, like my aunts and all of them cooked. They were the great cooks. So then no one made her cook because she just was terrible at it. So I didn't grow up with those dishes. I grew up with a lot of American fast food and American food. And so when people would ask me, where are you from? I'm like, New Jersey. And that was almost received as hostile. Like, no, where are you from? And I'm like, no, I'm from New Jersey.
I'm
Like,
going to be very honest here too. It wasn't until maybe 5+ years ago that I understood myself that India is Asian.
oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I still run into that today. And so this kind of education too of like what all identifies as Asia, right? And also like the kind of language that we're starting to learn and starting to implement more, not just in our own personal lives and spheres, but also in the workplace too.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of equitable, inclusive kind of language to try and be aware of those microaggressions or whatnot. So, for example, like I see how it's trickled down into different generations as well. Like, for example, my mom still uses the word Oriental when describing people and when describing herself. And I'm pretty sure it's because she comes from a generation, an era where that was the go to default term to describe Asian people, specifically of East Asian descent. And it breaks my heart, but it's also like, how do I approach this conversation with my mother of, Mom, that's not the term that I think is appropriate, and here's why. And, seeing that kind of dynamic has been very eye-opening to me, and also challenging for me, at least, like Michelle. How can I better my language, better my awareness towards all this?
Yeah.
So how do art and activism then intersect in your work and life now after having spent some time with these realizations and this new, not really new, but the work that you all are talking about? How has your art and activism shifted, and how has it started to intersect?
Personally, I've made the decision this year to stop doing work that I don't believe in. Um, I started out my career in Atlanta in an internship, and I remember the first professional show I got cast in was Miss Saigon. Um, and that was because the artistic director came and he saw that I was Asian, and he's like, "Well, I need Asian bodies for this." Me back then, I didn't realize it was a show that glorifies colonialism. I just was happy to have the opportunity. Um, even 2 years ago, I did South Pacific, another show which glorifies the othering of Asian people. And I've been doing this for a while. Uh, Speaking about personal experiences as an artist before these events, I remember doing a show at Georgia Ensemble. Michelle saw it. It was set in a small country, fictional country that bordered Mongolia and China. I was the only Asian person cast in that play. Everyone else was yellow facing. And not only that, every show I go into as an Asian male, I feel like I carry the burden of other Asian males. I feel like I'm representing a community. And this is something white people don't have to think about. I have to know my lines. I have to be perfect. I have to be twice as good, because if I fail, they're not going to cast another Asian, even in an Asian play.
Mm.
So I have to think about that every time I go into a process. So so in this play, for example, the entire rest of the ensemble, they didn't know their lines. Halfway through the play's run, they still didn't know their lines. And this is something I have to watch all the time. I have to watch other actors of different backgrounds fail upwards while I have to be perfect. That's the pressure I feel. So I've made it a personal goal of mine to not do work I don't believe in anymore. But also, again, talking about activism, there's been a lot, I'm glad Amee brought up, centering Blackness, centering Asianness. We have these competing movements, and they're not competing. But the way we're portrayed in the media and the way that the news media portrays these movements, they want to pit us against each other. They want to use Stop Asian Hate to throw Black Lives Matter under the bus. And it's fermenting a lot of hostility. These Asian hate crimes, they are a symptom of white supremacy. But the unfortunate fact is that most of the hate crimes perpetrated on Asian Americans are not happening from white people. They're happening from people of other oppressed backgrounds. And there's a lot of hostility that the news is complicit in breeding.
And you mentioned this before, and I actually wanted to talk about historically. That's true, but it is also because of where immigrants and where, people who are not American or are being forced to the fringes of it are forced to cohabitate, right? Like, I'm going to go back way back, well, not way back, but like the 90s, I think, the Watts riots, right? Rodney King riots. And I lived in a suburb of California at the time. And that particular suburb is very ethnically diverse. It's a lot of East Asians, I think there's a very large Korean population and Chinese population. And most of these people lived in the suburbs, in this really beautiful suburb, but their businesses were downtown, right? Their convenience stores, where they were allowed, or where their connections and networks were for business, were in these downtown areas. Because of course, I don't know. I mean, I'm saying now with the lens of what I know now, looking backward, that perhaps they weren't welcome to open, business licenses in these whiter suburbs or in these suburbs, but they were allowed to open businesses and given freely business licenses downtown in traditionally Black neighborhoods. So when those riots happened, their storefronts were the ones that were getting broken into. But no one at the time said this was racially motivated. There were not white stores, there was no Starbucks there getting broken down. There was no large, there wasn't a Target. It's going to be the mom and pop convenience store that was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Chen, my neighbor. And they now are out of this business. And at the time, it wasn't, I don't remember those articles being, Black on Asian violence. But I can see how what you were saying, because you mentioned that before, and I was thinking about that. And I'm like, I think that's because it is a product of white supremacy, right? It is a product of saying, we're going to put everyone we think who does not belong in this society together, and we're going to make them compete for resources, whether intentionally or not. That is what happens.
Well, and it's, a lot of it is a consequence of colonialism. A lot, people of all different backgrounds from Asia, different ideologies have come here as a result of foreign conflict that our country has imposed on other countries. And just like how a lot of, conservative, very nationalist members of the Cuban community, in the Latino community, they don't speak for the whole Cuban community. We have a lot of very reactionary conservative people who fled these liberation movements that were welcomed by America. So, Vietnam, Korea, and that intrinsic, reactionaryism, that conservatism, that because there is a lot of anti-Blackness in the Asian community, and it's specifically generational. The news media, they dig a knife into that. There's this, we want to abolish the police, right? We want to defund the police, but they're trying to divide a wedge and say, well, no, Asians actually want more police. They're trying to pit us against each other when the root cause is imperialism.
Or they
in
redirect
both
it
of
off
these.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like NBC putting up that horrible article or news thing about how Black Americans can help with the Asian American community at this time. And I knew
Yeah.
that blew up like a couple weeks ago when that came out. And it's like, shame on NBC. You
It's
know, like
insidious.
you got to look at the sources of where these this propaganda is coming from, and to tie it back into the artistic community. And I know we're focusing a lot more on theater, obviously, as a lot of us have a theater background, but as far as like what we are doing and changing and mixing this art with activism, I'm with Skye too. I'm very much calling out people and companies if something is happening, because what's been happening a lot, especially before we had a virtual town hall last year for our artists of color to have a safe space to speak upon any of the injustices that they have experienced themselves and maybe haven't had a chance to air it out and put it out in the spotlight. And we had probably some artists that were sharing things that happened decades ago. And how long and what effects does that make on oneself when you harbor that for years? And I'm gonna say it, like there's certain artistic directors, like with City Springs Theater, that even when we come across, a certain issue and the way that that's handled and the way that response is and the way certain messages are being sent and received, I'm tired of being silent about it. And it's hard because there's so many repercussions that happen with that, right? This is a business of power. Any business is a business of power. And so with the Atlanta theater community, we barely get paid that much anyway. So it's like, a lot of new artists, especially, they're just struggling just to get a gig, just to get paid. And if that's their only line of income, they're screwed, So it's like a way of kissing feet and making sure that these artistic leaders or these producers or whatnot are happy with you and they like you. And the way that you assimilate to a ideal kind of look or person is kind of the only way to be successful in these kind of jobs. And so you see it in the TV industry and film industry so much more, but now you're seeing this trend of accountability and of these producers like Scott Rudin being called out. And, are they being fully investigated or not? What are the surrounding and protective means and grounds that are saving their positions, right? How are HR departments infiltrating and doing anything? Are they being, a little slap on the wrist and being excused afterwards? So looking into that and into the internal affairs more, I think is important, and maybe something that I would encourage more people to do, as opposed to, oh, it's this place doing this show.
Michelle, I'm glad you mentioned that, and the idea that activism and what people are doing, right? Because that you're not doing shows that you don't believe in, that you're not just kissing feet. And this whole idea of kissing feet, I sometimes think that theater artists, especially when we're not being paid, right? We're struggling to make ends meet. So much of theater is relegated to the world of nonprofit that just our showing up is an act of activism. We don't all have to be marching, but this is an act of activism. If I am showing up, if I'm saying I'm not just going to do South Pacific, if I'm not just going to do Miss Gun, I'm just, if I'm going to do all the roles, and that's activism, because I'm promoting this idea that Asian excellence is a given, not just because I'm going to work hard, but because we are excellent. We're not just victims, and we don't just need protests. And I think that the less we think of art as a charity, the more we can think of it as a platform for activism. Yeah, right.
Especially when it comes to organizations that were built originally to help support that idea, such as the unions, such as Actors Equity. Let's talk about that, right? So a place that in a system built to support, protect, these theater makers. And what is it doing right now? During all of this mess, on top of a pandemic, with all the social and racial justices that are being brought forth, and they're still asking for your money for dues, like it's going against the school of fish, and just being brave enough to not only go against that current, but also to say something about it. And I think that's the next step that I'm seeing people take nowadays. It's not just they're personally stepping back and saying no, but they're being silent about it. Instead, they're not being silent about it anymore. And so whatever means that means, go for it, please. Because if you don't, who will, right? I mean, even going back to the racial town hall reckoning that we had, yes, there were a lot of things that were uncovered and a lot of things that were put to light, but there were also a lot of things that weren't. And specifically, there were even discussions afterwards of like, I'm surprised this wasn't called out, or this person, or this theater company, or whatnot. And there's a reason for that, because of all the fear that someone would say something and what would happen to them, right? So tying it back into like AAPI community, I saw Amee's been doing this too with this idea of, instead of marketing on the kind of pessimism of it and the victimization, it's more so redirecting it into a positive light, like Asian excellence. And instead of looking at us as victims with this whole history, right? And this whole, South Asian, the Mesa community too. Like this has been happening, especially when it blew up with 9/11, right? No pun intended, but it's just, we have to look at those historical trends and how far they've trickled into, our art system as well. The fact that like, you only bring in an Indian actor or a Mesa actor, for example, when the setting calls for it, or the character calls for it, or because you're trying to cast someone who is a terrorist. Yeah, just I look at a lot of the commercials that I see and a lot of ads, and I'm also being very cognizant of where I put my money towards. Like there's a film that Skye keeps talking about, and I'm glad you keep telling people about it, that this movie that's coming out with the Korean War,
Yeah.
you're seeing how that's
Yeah.
propaganda itself.
Well, okay. So this is a good transition, and what I want to talk about too.
Okay, great.
It's not just about, as far as being an arts, organization that doesn't have a lot of Asian representation, as far as what you can do, it's not good enough to put just tokenize an Asian artist, in your diversity slot. It's not good enough to, pander to this zeitgeist of woke liberalism we have right now. I think Hollywood's a perfect example of that. Let's look at the way Amazon right now is profiting off of Black trauma with the series Them. They're profiting off, and whether the artistic merits of it, I haven't seen it. I've just read reviews. They're trying to show how woke they are by doing these stories, but at the same time, they waged a massive disinformation campaign against the Alabama Union voters, of which 80% of them are Black laborers. So are they really woke? Are they practicing what they preach? And so how does our storytelling and our practices as organizations, feed into that? Are we practicing what we're preaching? Hollywood right now, this next year, it's Oscar bait. They're doing a war movie, a Korean war movie about integration of the army, right? About a Black war hero and a white war hero overcoming racial differences by blowing up a bunch of Chinese people, and you don't get military equipment from Hollywood unless the military signs off on your script. So it is propaganda, right? So how, that's all big macro structure. We're just tiny arts organizations, but how are we different from Jeff Bezos if we don't practice what we preach, right? How are we different from that? It's great that we're making land acknowledgements. I'm glad that is a popular thing to do now. It's a step in the right direction, but is that to absolve our own guilt, or what actions are we taking to actually help the indigenous communities here?
And also to tie into that, seeing the systems, right? And how they're implementing more training and doing more like anti-bias workshop or just racial awareness or whatever. And that's great. But it's also just being conscious of like, is that the real work? And is the real work starting with you as an individual as opposed to the whole conglomerate or the group, right? Because I mean, you can identify as your organization and your corporation or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's the work has to start from you individually. Um, I think the other example I wanted to bring up too, to go back with the whole like changing it from a pessimist to an optimistic kind of view. Um, I've always considered myself a minority, but I recently just saw something that it's not I'm a minority, I've been minoritized.
Hmm.
And so this shifting of perspective, and seeing, how the oppressor or the oppressive system around you, has changed that language and changed that perspective has been very eye-opening. Um, yeah, hopefully my money spends just as it does with everyone else in America. So if so, I'm very, very careful of where I put it towards. And I think, this whole donation thing that's happening right now, right? Especially with us, not being able to be out in person as much. And, how does activism, what does that look like in actionary steps? Um, is it where you put your money? Is it where you uplift someone or some voice? Is it where you put your interest in and opening that scope of that? Like if all your podcasts that you're listening to are kind of one sort of genre or one sort of demographic, let's look at that. Um, yeah, I think art and activism, like they're so deeply related that they can't be separated. And then that whole question of like, are arts organizations, are theaters supposed to be um, for art activism? Like are those separate or intertwined things? And that's something that I think is defined with each theater, each organization, and their mission statement and so forth. Um, and it's all overwhelming.
Yeah, resources are thin. I don't know what it's like to be an arts administrator. I don't, so I can't empathize with those struggles. But at the same time, if you can't acknowledge that your art is activism, that theater has been trying to catch up to film so much that it's trying to emulate Hollywood. It's trying to emulate, this macro consumerist, arts culture that comes out of Hollywood. And if you're going to do that and not actually be, an activist with your art, then you're just contributing to your own irrelevancy. It's a dying art form, and you're just complicit in its death.
I think the fact that there are people and communities who don't have to think of art as activism, where it is a choice for them, that to me is something that I sit with a lot, because for a while I've avoided the activism world because when I do enter it, I get emotional and it's hard. And especially ironically, in our community, being vulnerable outwardly, showing your emotions, especially if you're a woman of color, can be seen as all sorts of, there's shame in that you're being too much. There's a lot of like, that's too much, you're showing too much. So what I'm hearing is we all, like at least in the Asian community, we have had this sense of you have your art and you have activism, and it somehow always ends up interconnecting. But there are plenty of companies and plenty of people who feel like they don't need to be part of the activism world. It's a choice for them. So I guess it takes me to my next question. You all have been invited to panels over this last month, and you seem super excited about them. We at Seven Stages, like we will call ourselves out on the fact that we have not done as many Asian or Asian American shows, experiences, events as we ought to be doing. So this is one of our first sort of steps into starting a constant conversation, a conversation that becomes more regular than just, hey, this terrible tragic event happened, let's round up all the Asian folks and get them talking to each other. But rather this is, let's have this community come together and continue to come together as we learn better. How has it been for you all to have to be invited to these panels, to have to speak for the community, to have answers, to be basically spokespeople of all of Asia, because that's not a lot or anything, just to over 1 billion people. But yeah, how does it feel?
Well, I want to address two parts of that. Yes, the talking about the panelists, but also not doing plays that are about Asians or include Asians. And one of how I met Michelle with East by Southeast is we were doing these plays that were originally on the Kilroy list, which, you know, honors and highlights women playwrights. But specifically, we found these plays that spoke to us that were written by Asian descended artists. The one that I participated in, particularly as an actor, it was called Orange by Aditi Kapil. And it was not a story about the Asian experience. It was a hero's journey about an autistic girl. And it was set, the context of it, the setting of it was California, and the actors themselves just happened to be Asian. So they talked about Indian touchstones, cultural touchstones, but but that in itself, doing that play is sort of my activism, because my focus isn't to say you should be doing more Asian plays. We should be doing American plays and remember that Americans do include Asians. And that story, and I remember the feedback from our audience. We did a salon reading of it, and it was a primarily white audience. And their reaction was, oh, I expected something very different. Like, I expected this to be about Indian Americans or Asians, and this was not, you know, and this was about this girl's journey as someone on the autistic spectrum. And that was the conversation, right? It was this, you could easily see this on Amazon with an all white cast and people would be like, oh, this is a great play. But you immediately put Asian faces on it and suddenly there's an expectation that it has to be a very specific story. So that's, you know, because
Asians don't deal with autism.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, I don't know. And so that's the kind of activism. And I know, like, Jack has been in a play at Aurora that wasn't, you know, that was just a love story. That's very much, it just happened to be by an Asian person and featured two Asian people, but it was a love story. And it wasn't, unfortunately, marketed that way. Right. So, you know, they were trying to capitalize on this idea that they had Asian actors and an Asian playwright, instead of just capitalizing on the fact that it's a love story with a great script and two brilliant actresses, or actor and actress. But speaking for everybody, I don't feel like I speak for everybody. In fact, I got very nervous when I saw Karuna on the call, because I'm like, oh goodness, I know nothing about being Indian. Like, I know nothing about being Mesa. I'm just going to say things and she's going to be like, no, that's not how it is in the culture. So yeah, exactly. I get very nervous because my experience is my experience. And I know it's a very different experience. And I think I mentioned it earlier, where when I say I'm from New Jersey, it sometimes is like sometimes I get a hostile reaction. Like, I'm intentionally trying to thwart their idea that they're being considered enough to notice that I'm something different. And I'm coming at them going, no, I'm not different. I'm from New Jersey, you know? And so sometimes I feel very defensive. Like, I have to prove that I am an Asian actor who can speak on these things. So that's how I feel about it.
I've been feeling very overwhelmed. And I had a pretty big mental breakdown like 2 weeks after the shooting. It had a lot of pros and cons to it. You know, I had a lot of people, a lot of artistic leaders, a lot of friends that reached out to me. And, you know, whether just to check on me as Michelle, and then just to offer this opportunity of, you know, because of, and yes, we think this is an important discussion to have, an important panel to have, and blah, blah, blah. And I think what bothered me most was I was kind of the only person in their mind, and it's not their fault. I'm not saying that at all, but it goes to tell you, like, why aren't there more people that they could also reach out to? Um, and not whose fault is it, but just what does that mean? I know there's a lot of people who identify like me and have similar feelings like me, but where is that disconnect, right? And is it a form of like, who's the loudest? I know that I feel I'm pretty loud about this kind of stuff. And, I use my social media as a tool for that specifically. But is there a way that I can help change that? So that I'm not always this go-to kind of representative, especially when it comes to Atlanta theater community. Where are the investments being put in here? And that's something that East by Southeast has always been interested in working on. We can't just be it, and you can't just stop with us and not be happy with how good or bad we are and then outsource, which you see that all the time. There's not enough talent or there's not enough people to do this and this and that here in Atlanta. So we got to go to New York. We got to go to LA, whatever. I don't think it always has to be that way. So yeah, I always go into spaces like this, hopefully with the assumption, if not the transparency, that I have to say out loud, I am speaking as myself and my individual thoughts and feelings, and we are not a monolith. No one is a representation of their culture, their demographic, their race, whatnot. And so I think it's unfortunate that that has to be said sometimes, but I hope that it becomes a more community assumption. So I feel like also if I don't say something, who will? So. Oh, Skye, I don't know if you're talking, but we can't hear
Oh,
you.
sorry. Yeah. I was just agreeing with you. Yeah. It's 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 very fatiguing, especially because it's not just these panels. I'm having these conversations with people. It's daily. I'm having conversations with people about this. But I don't mind it because I wouldn't. I don't know if I would have been invited to this if I didn't shit post on Facebook all the time. Yeah, I've centered myself as the person that is vocal about this. So of course people, come to me and they come to, Michelle, because we have this East by Southeast organization and we have been vocal. So we've centered ourselves. Amee brought up that point the other day that, we've kind of put ourselves in this position. And I personally don't mind it, but it is fatiguing. It's a lot of emotional labor because not everyone's receptive to it. Some people are really combative.
Jack, I'd like to ask you, what has been your experience with these sorts of conversations? You mentioned the play you were in recently, I believe, and like, what has been like for you to go from an Asian actor to now we're looking at you for some sort of guidance into the AAPI community and wanting to hear your thoughts?
Yeah. So starting with like just being like a young kid trying to learn who, still having my own identity issues right now, but growing up, yeah, I had a lot of identity issues. That led me towards acting to find myself basically. But what I did not know is that getting into this led me to a little bit more problematic things that I never encountered before. I've dealt with so many things that was blatantly racist. Like I part of a play where I had to dress like a Chinese communist with a red star, and at the time I didn't know, being ignorant. I'm just an artist, just like, okay, this is what I do. It's college. Finding myself. But my goodness, I am a Chinese communist. part of a play called Le Justice Assassin. It's a French play talking about basically the what is the morality of people and during a place of war, like what is right and what is wrong, and they kind of just put 4 ethnic people, which is myself, who's Eastern Asian, someone who was Hispanic who had to be Muslim when she's not Muslim, and a Trinidadian actress who had to play another race, and it was just all mixed up. It was just so weird, you know. But yeah, that kind of that sparked a little bit of like questioning of like what's going on here, you know. And then I transitioned to film and TV, and that was a whole, excuse my language, it was a shit show. Like I'm still constantly tired of what's going on with the film and TV community, because yes, they want to make change. They say they want to diversify. They want to add inclusion and everything, but they're doing it in the wrong way. It's so like messed up. It's I think like what Skye was doing, the devotion, you got a devotion audition, and it was based off, you know, colonialism. It's like what you like, and Skye, what's your ethnicity again? It's Filipino or
Filipino, yeah.
Filipino, right? Yeah. So they're constantly just giving us different races just because we are Asian, and like they're like, oh, here, just play this race, you know. And I don't know for my other Asian actors and actresses, but I constantly get roles that I know do not fit me. It does not fit in the story. So we're considered wild cards. And I like I'm literally like every audition I'm getting, like I kid you not, over 50% of them are wild cards. And it's not just because it's like, oh, we're just throwing all ethnicity and any age, whatever, just because we want to save our own asses. It's just more of like, oh, what can you do? Let's just take a look. That was good, but we don't want it. But we just did it. We wanted you to do it just because. I'm just like, and it took me a while to really realize, like, why the hell am I taking all this effort to get ready, do my hair, all this stuff, and learn these lines, do the performance, tape it, edit it, send it, and all these things, and it's stressing me out. I'm like, am I gonna get it? Am I not gonna get it? Like, it's just like ridiculous. And it's very unfortunate because I want those people who are running the show business to understand that if you clearly cannot see uh, any person of ethnicity or Asian American specifically that do not fit the story, why the hell would you send this audition to us, you know, or let us audition? And yes, the casting directors and the people, producers and everything, they all say, oh, just audition because it's an opportunity. Because you never know, if you don't send it in, you might just change our mind. And they're like, but it's frustrating because there has to be a way to just deliver us these auditions for the story, to tell the right story. Prime example, I auditioned for this role for the 1996 Olympics that takes place in the 1996 Olympics, right? And the role is a swimmer, a US swimmer. And I looked at it, I'm like, okay, US swimmer, let me go to Google. White, 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 one black, white, 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 white. Okay, why am I here? I guess I have to go in to see what happens. And this was just like a couple years ago. So everything that's been happening lately, I've been a little bit more spoken up and being more of an activist about this because it's wrong. And I went anyways because of an opportunity. And yeah, I changed the storyline, and I made myself a Japanese swimmer, and I did basically try show someone who saved everyone's lives. and to that main character, and I did the respectful Japanese bow and thank you for saving everyone, you know? And the casting director was like, oh, that was good, but can you do something else different? Like you're stretching. I'm like, okay, great. But I showed you something different, you know? Obviously it wasn't written that way, but I wanted to show something different. Obviously I didn't get the role, but it's just that I wanted to kind of like show that, you know, this is wrong, but yet I'm here to change the story up because I'm one in like 100 people you just called in, and like all I'm seeing is white and black people next to me. Like, why am I here for a 1996 Olympic role? It doesn't make any sense. But I just really hope that eventually the showrunners and people can actually like give these roles for people that are accurately portrayed, especially periodic pieces. Like, you know, it's just we want to make sure that we are involved and we can tell these stories. And sorry, I'm just getting a little heated because that's what I've been dealing with every day, and it's just frustrating me. And then it's even more frustrating because ever since the shooting happened, um, I've been really sad. You know, it's just unfortunate that this happened, and a lot of people reached out to me, and I'm very fortunate of them. And but there was an increase of commercial auditions that came out, and a lot of commercial auditions were like specifically looking for Asian, and I'm just like, oh, what a coincidence! What's going on over here, you know? And all of a sudden, you know, I'm getting these like callbacks, and I didn't book the role, and whatever. But
I've been seeing that trend too, Jack. And here's my hope with it. It sucks that this had to be the reason why we're now being more considered with that representation, but I'm gonna take it for the benefit of the doubt, right? But what I'm hoping is that it's not just a trend or a fad that dies away until a new tragedy happens or something else, you know? I mean, that was the whole thing with like when Crazy Rich Asians came out and they were marketing the fact that this was how many years since Joy Luck Club, an American film featured an all Asian cast. And there was an article I read about how, you know, what are ways that we can maintain this inclusivity without letting it trend with the rise and falls of these, you know, relevant times. That's my hope with that kind of work. And I'm thankful for the considerations and the openness with that. I just hope it doesn't go away. Or it doesn't have to be a spotlight that can't be shared. You know, it's like, oh, we only have one or two spotlights and we have to, you know, put it around other demographics here, not just race, but you know, that's not how that works. I think it's an unlimited supply here, but we're not evening the playing field enough. Or you're just seeing where those decisions are being made, like with film, producers, or you have the writers or the casting directors, you know, I've been told that there is a show that films here in Atlanta that unless the character description specifically says Asian, they normally never consider pulling in an Asian actor. And that's coming from casting themselves.
Yeah,
And I was like,
And you bring
yikes.
in, you know, the idea, you know, Jack, that here's something that anyone can do. If you are in a room, if you are a director or a producer or a writer, and your non-white person, whoever that is, brings cultural sensitivity into the room, then the only answer is to go, huh, thank you. It is not to say, well, can you do something else? That's not what we meant. You know, just because Jack, you brought in cultural sensitivity into that. You know, you brought an authenticity to that, and they wanted to just put you in a box, right? And I realized you said that story, and it made me realize a similar situation where I did affect a little change. It did mean that I got much less screen time because their change required the whole day for them to address this situation. But I got cast to do henna, right? and they wanted my hands and they wanted henna. Now this was for Delta, totally called them out. And they wanted all this jewelry and they asked me to bring it. I was like, okay, you do know that that's not how we travel, right? And there was 3 or 4 other Asian Mesa actors and actresses, and they're like, hey, you know, you're not going to get through security with all that jewelry. Like, you have to take it off. And I said, and I wouldn't go, like, they thought they could just do the henna and then they could show the henna not finished, like it was still drying. And I said, you know, I can't move my hands with the henna, and then you want me to take off jewelry on top? Like, I don't understand. Do you and and it was an all white you know, crew production, and she's luckily for me, the director listened and the assistant director listened to us, and they said, oh, well, I guess then you just need to sit here. How long do you need to have this on your hands? And we were like, well, about 2 or 3 hours at the very least, you know. So they said, okay, well, we'll film you at the end of the day. So by the time they got to me and that time I washed it all off, there was just, you know, I was just in the one scene and that's all they could use. But the fact that they didn't even think about that, you know, the fact that there was no one in this who saw this spec, who saw the layout, who said, I mean, I can't even believe Delta didn't go, you know, we wouldn't let them on the plane with all that stuff on. Like, I just don't understand.
On top of the sensitivity of like racial profiling with airlines anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So that was very fun. Cultural sensitivity. I had a good experience in that they listened to me. It did come at, you know, if I was thinking as an actor, I'm going to get less screen time. I mean, you're paying me the same, that's fine. But, you know, there is that balance, right? We bring in that cultural sensitivity. And then if someone doesn't listen, I don't know what I would have done if they were like, I don't know, do it anyway.
I've got an anecdote, and I'm ashamed of it. I'm really ashamed of it because I should have done something different, but I was fresh in my career. And this is a glimpse into what Asian actors have to go through all the time in every in-person audition for a film. This was for Pitch Perfect 3. I think this character got written out because it was so blatantly racist. It was the private chef to the white male lead, and it was a Japanese character that did not speak. You know, he spoke in broken English. But he practiced this mystic hand art that I looked up, and it wasn't even a Japanese. It was like Indian or something. So just total, like, no cultural respect or even research. And I get into the audition room, and it's just a bunch of Asian males. Like, there's no type. We're all just Asian. That's the only common denominator. And this old gentleman, like, leans over to me, and he asks, are you going to do the accent? And I said, I don't know. I'm going to try it without first, and I'll see what happens when they ask me to. You know, the character, they're obviously looking for Ken Jeong from The Hangover. They're looking for that type of Asian, but they called all the Asians. So I go in, and I would name drop this casting director, but it was so traumatic and triggering to me at the time that I didn't know what to do. Like, my mind blanked. I didn't remember who was in the room. I just felt like I had to get out. I walked in and I did a very grounded interpretation of the character. And this white blonde casting director said, okay, that was fine. Can you do it more pussy Japanese guy? Can you do it more pussy Japanese guy? And I tried my best. She wanted me to fucking improv in a language I didn't know. And I wrote this as part of my play that's being produced or developed at the Alliance coming up. And it sounds comedic, and it sounds like I exaggerated it. And I did a little bit, but not much. That's, you know, and I walked out of that room with the most shame I've ever had as an actor. And if that happened to me now, I would have caused a storm,
Yeah.
you know.
Thank you all so much for your honesty. Let's shift it a little bit to if anyone here has questions. I believe, Corona, you have a question for the group?
Sure. Actually, more of a comment. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this. So, you know, I'm a first generation immigrant, right? I came here at age 24. I've lived here. I'm 62 now, so I've lived here for 37 years. And work in the health field. I'm not an actor. And my personal experience really has been that American bigotry often tends to concentrate their racism with black and white, you know, and they're so consumed by this, the blackness of Black Americans and the whiteness of white Americans, that other forms of racism, which are based on the other people's non-Black folks' differentness, you know, my differentness is so obvious. It's not just my color of my skin, it's my accent, it's my mannerisms, which is wonderful to see all you actors doing all of this at home. But but all of those makes my differentness so obvious. But often that this form of American bigotry is so consumed by this Black and whiteness, from my experience, that often I have felt Asians, folks like me, go sort of under the radar, or have often gone under the radar. And that kind of comes across people who are not American born and bred, don't have blue eyes and blonde hair. It is taken almost as a sort of a very oppressive privilege. And often that being under the radar is a privilege and a repression, not oppression, but a repression. So it's kind of a strange place to be. And that is the place that, since I'm not American, I am American. I took my oath and all that, but I was not born American. I'm American Indian, of Indian descent, that I feel that it is in the microaggressions, as Michelle brought up, that my work is mainly done in. You know, how do I go from, all of you brought it up so beautifully, you know, how you marginalized and put in little boxes of where you belong or where you shouldn't belong, all in the periphery of what is. And even though you're such a big part of the real world, that things like these aggressions will come in the form of, gosh, you know, I am fair, I'm biracial. My father is Indian, my mother was Australian. So basically they'd say, wow, your accent, you know, you are must be Italian, which is a white person inviting me into their dining room, or saying, gosh, are you Mexican, which is to say, do my yard. And so these are, and none of them are meant to be in any way obviously aggressive, but these are certainly categorizing me, putting me in the place that is most comfortable to them. And I feel that as I hear you guys and I listen to you, and in my field, I have a place of power. My work, my profession gives me a sense of power. Not gives me a sense of power. I am in a place of power. I'm a physician, so they'll come in, and there's already a power differential when they walk in, whether you want it or not. That in spite of it, how do they get across to me their betterness and point out to me my differentness? And it's done in such wonderfully subtle ways. And I think that has been a challenge. And as I listen to you guys talking to each other, how the differences, how my people who I work with, how in so many subtle ways, whether some joke is okay, or that I can be your buddy by sharing this joke, which is putting down another, you know, all of these things that happen in a work area are places that maybe I can, as stand up, you know, and then my office forms the HR forms the world, doesn't it? So I think that I just wanted to share that and say you guys are wonderful and amazingly articulate in how you just kind of put it all out there for us to look at. And I really
Thank you,
thank you.
Kurna. I just want to say, I think a lot of the things that you spoke upon were all dynamics of the model minority myth.
Yep.
And I'll pass it to Skye.
Yep.
That was very, very well articulated. You know, and it seemed, I think that's the primary issue of what's happening today, you know, in Asian relationships, API relationships with the rest of the country. You know, we have this idea of fascism being linked with white supremacy, and we refuse to acknowledge the possibility that fascism can be multicultural. There, you know, and so, you know, there's this big concentration on black and white dynamics, and the rest of us ethnicities we're used as some sort of buffer between that. Yeah, as if, you know, in a lot of the ways how the middle class is a buffer for, you know, actual revolution, it feels like Asian Americans are a buffer, you know, so that white America doesn't take all of the blame. We're being used as pawns. That's what it feels like to me. And so I think fundamentally we have to change the conversation. We have to get away from liberal identity politics. You know, it's not good enough to just have representation. You got to mean it. Like, who gives a shit? Who gives a shit if Biden has a bust of Cesar Chavez in his office? He's still got kids in camps. Who cares? Who cares that Kamala Harris is a, you know, black female VP if she wants to strengthen police? They want to fund police more, you know? And I know not everyone here might not agree with me, but we got to get away from this idea that just because someone is a part of our, you know, ethnic group, that they are serving in our best interests. We gotta fundamentally be anti-war, for one, and we have to fundamentally, you know, check racism on all sides, whether that's rhetoric, whether that's actions. You know, we got to check our anti-blackness in the Asian community. White people need to check their biases. Black people need to check their biases. We all have work to do, and we can't just be loyal to our ethnic agendas, because that's what liberal identity politics does. It divides us up like that.
I see Ashley's hand too.
Should we take it down? I'm lowering it.
Yep.
I'm lowering it so it would go away. Not because I didn't want to speak. I mean, first, thank you all for.
Can I say something? If your screen is on mute, could you do that now, please? Because it's rare.
Well, first, thank you all for just kind of being in this space and sharing. I mean, I have tons of thoughts and I'm like taking down a lot of them, but I'm kind of just really interested, you know, in Jack's story and Skye's story, and like I'm sure plenty of others just as actors, like this idea of as storytellers, we approach, you know, like I have apprehension when people are like, oh, I'm going to do a Black story, I'm going to do the multicultural. I'm not even gonna lie, I have apprehension with like talks like these, where it's like, you know, in response to these events, and it's like, well, without any follow through, you know, it eventually becomes a thing that happened, a thing that was nice, a thing that hopefully we will all remember and it's good, but what is the follow through like? And I can remember, you know, and I've been kind of working mostly in the film industry since landing in Atlanta. And I promise you, like every time I'm on a set, I immediately want to quit because it's just like the dynamics of what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing and the culture being so harsh, but I kind of force myself to push in so I can kind of like, I really want to know what are these discussions that are actually happening. And, you know, to your point about this idea of, well, let's get this character in here, let's bring in this Asian, let's bring in this Black. And it's really, those are exactly how the conversations happen. You know, just this last week during like table reads that were happening as they're still casting this film, it's like, we need some more diversity for this very white show, on a call where I know that the director and the EP and the line producer and the production supervisor and all of the people trickling down are all white. And it's like, you know, the conversation, you want to have it now because it looks well. You want to cast a diverse small Santa for this film because it's going to look as though you have diversity You know what I mean? But then in the same vein, in this same week, you know, the young Black director's assistant is fired because of the way you've treated them, you know? So it's going back to something you said, Michelle, about this idea of like, what is really the individual action? You know, like how are we treating everyone on a micro level, exterior, macro, grand gestures that we do? And it's just, as storytellers, like even for me, it's like, how do we approach it? I remember my first year in film school, you know, a young white woman who had just kind of spent the summer in Kenya, you know, and she was coming back with a lot of good intentions, you know, and I remember they had us do these kind of, you know, not diversity courses, but kind of, you know, courses about language and about all these things and about, you know, political correctness and all that stuff. And in this course, she said, well, I want to write a film with a Black female lead and I'm going to do her right. And I immediately said, well, what does that mean to do her right? What is the story that you're going to put her in? What is the research that you're going to do? Which I think, you know, to your point, Jack, is this idea of like, and Skye, you know, even like, what is the research that you've actually done? And the story that you told about Delta is like a little bit of research. We have, you know what I mean? Just takes that away, takes that ignorance away, you know? And it's like, why can we not spend that 10 minutes, you know, as you did before you went in for this character and say, well, actually, this is not something that, you know what I mean? Like, why is it? And I think that's the challenge, like really getting to the root of it. As artists, everything starts at story, for me at least. So how are we finding these stories that are actually asking the questions at that level before they put the pen to paper?
It's that investment. You're absolutely right, Ashley. And I think it has to start from those higher positions or the source. You know, we have to encourage and invest more in these writers and these, you know, young actors that are starting to bud so they don't have to go somewhere else to feel like they can have an actual career. Or, you know, your boards or your, you know, any of those decision-making positions, like it's really all internal stuff that you got to look into. You can't just hire a box office assistant that is someone that's non-white and call it a day. So
Also, you brought up a good point about, you know, the follow through. And I find when I first started intersecting my art with activism and social justice, I was feeling really guilty because my activism is not going to be shouting on Facebook or in the front of a protest. I'm not going to the big rallies. I don't really like crowds. I'm a small person. I don't always feel safe in crowds anyway, even at festivals, you know, so that's not my activism. But I realize that my activism is one-on-one. I'm going to be the person, and I always have been the person to say, hey, that's not right. Do I need to talk to you one-on-one? I may not do it in front of everybody, but later on, you know, I had a conversation with that makeup artist, with that director. I've had a conversation with artistic directors in a room saying, this isn't right. We need to talk about what you're saying. Instead of looking at what looks good, you know, you like that image. You do realize this isn't something that would actually occur in real life. Like, I just need you to know that isn't something. And then, you know, that's what I can do, is I can bring that up. And if they choose to ignore it, then that's a clocking mechanism for me. That's like, I don't want to work with you again. And I have not worked with directors or writers or other actors again when I have brought up, you know, I've taken, I guess for some people it is a matter of courage. For me, it's just a matter of, I'm just need to tell you how I feel. But in, you know, that act of courage of saying this is culturally inappropriate and I'm going to talk to you one-on-one, a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. But that's my active, you know, I'm uncomfortable with, I could never do what Michelle and Skye do with, you know, I love following their Facebook stuff because I'm like, I can never do that. I'm always like, Facebook's fun. But, you know, I like all the stuff that they do and that they're constantly using social media and their platform to do these things.
I want to amplify what you just said, Amee, because
Yeah.
I think that is such a huge tool that is overlooked a lot. It's just the one-on-one conversations that you have with people and just connecting as souls, as people. So I was on a panel where my friend called it the Black and Asian Summit. Anyways, so we got some people who identified as Black and people who identified as Asian together. No, it was a visual podcast, I guess you can say. But anywho, and it was just to talk about like the conflicts as well as the solidarity with the times that are happening recently. And it was a live kind of event where people could comment, and audience members that wanted to share things or ask questions. And one of the comments was from a Black male who said that I just don't see the Asian community really doing anything when it comes to supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when it comes to these one-on-one conversations, or just conversations in general, what I have been working on a lot is about language tools and techniques of how to properly navigate this conversation without it blowing up, right? Finding your balance of respect. So, I was very, very aware from the beginning when I addressed his comments on the show of, your anger, and because he added emotional descriptions to that, and I said your anger and the way that this is completely valid, because that is the truth of your experience. And if that is unfortunately something that's all you have seen, who am I to deny that or to say no, that's not what's happening? So finding those tools of validating and not taking away someone's emotional response to things or their opinions without trying to overload and kind of bulldoze your opinion or your emotional response to it, right? It's that healthy balance of boundary that you have to find. So I disagreed with him, but I tried to make it very transparent that I acknowledge your emotion on this, and I'm so sorry that happened to you. And that makes me so heartbroken to see that has been your experience. And I can tell you from my side of things that I have seen otherwise happening. And I hope that maybe you can see that too one day. And I hope that reaches you sooner than later. So, as opposed to all these Facebook horrible arguments that happens, right? And just finding the correct environment to have these difficult conversations, I think is something that as individuals, we could all look towards working on. And just as a plug, Idea ATL is teaming up with ATAJ to have a workshop about language. So maybe check that out.
Well, there's also this idea that, I was on that panel with you, and this idea that support or anti-racism or anti-bigotry or any of this is transactional is not correct, in my opinion. Like being anti-racist or supporting a movement should not be, what have they done for me, right? It should be just a thing. Like it should just be a philosophy and not a capitalist transaction.
For this because I think it's right, as opposed to, it's not something that really bothers me.
And I think that's a lot of what we get into, especially in the arts, where we have that line where we don't want to speak up because we're going to lose something specific to us. I'm not going to get cast. And for myself, I always just assumed I'm not getting cast because I just sucked at that audition. Even though, I know it might have to do with the way I look, those things are out of my control, right? All I can do is just present the best part I can do, and then I move on. But if I'm going to say something, like I said something to the Delta director, if he had said, okay, we can't use you, okay, I'm still going to get paid because I showed up today. You're going to lose out, and I'm never going to work for you guys again. Like, and I'm going to make sure that everybody knows this is how I was treated. But I don't think of it as a transactional thing. Like, I didn't expect to get anything in return when I said it. So I suppose that's the thing. The activism and the follow through is you have to be able to be okay with the consequences of not working with that particular person. And then we all have to make that decision. Is working with a negative or a toxic energy worth it? Is it? Because in the end, I don't think it is, because we can't take this with us, right? We can't. And at the end of our lives, that's what we're going to look back and say, oh, I should have spoken up. And I hated it. It broke my heart with the town hall when so many people said they've been carrying these things for 10, 20 years. It was just broke my heart, because I am such a person in the moment. I don't want to think about this in 20 years. I want to say something now and let it live with you and let it live with me, and then move on and be better. That's what I'm hoping for.
I've got
No.
oh, I'm sorry. So I've got 2 cents. Both organizational and both individual, from an individual standpoint. I think 7 Stages is a great example of what, how to institute change. I mean, you all have recently restructured some arts leadership, and you have a lot of different producers of different backgrounds, and you ask the question, how can we keep, sustain this conversation and include AAPI members in our arts community. And, I would, I would not stress trying to fill some diversity in terms of what shows you're producing. Do the work that's relevant, that you think is relevant. The fact that you are a diverse team of producers, hopefully that comes through, because that's where it starts. As far as an individual, where do we go from here? As much as Amee said, we're in this capitalist, transaction mindset, we're also in this capitalist, pressure to produce all the time. I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. I'm not being anti-racist enough. And while there is truth to that for a lot of people, you have to acknowledge that just the mere fact that you might have your radical thinking, that's power enough. In a lot of cases, if you can change your mindset to a radical thought process, then that's going to influence people around you in your day-to-day life. So you don't have to be out, shouting on a megaphone and giving speeches. Not everyone has to do that. Everyone serves in their own unique way.
Thank you all. So we have 15 minutes left. We'd just like to check in with everyone and maybe sort of acknowledge all the things or some of the things that we want to take away from this conversation. I'll start. This has been really, this was needed. You don't know how much you need it until it happens, and while it's happening, I can feel like nurture, like my body needed it, my heart needed to have a conversation about something that, for me personally, the only people I get to have these conversations with and be completely vulnerable is like family. But even then, you have to have a certain way to navigate that as well. My dad, especially after 9/11, he has gone through probably the most trauma in our family when it comes to dealing with the police and racism and blatant. I mean, he was shot at one point. He got arrested by a SWAT team because they thought he was someone else. Just story after story. And I've watched this, like he's the strongest man in the world to me, right? Like he's my baba. And to see this man like get weighed down and down and down, and trying to talk to my parents, trying to talk to this older Asian community to say like, we are the issue as well. It's a back and forth, like we get attacked, we attack back. We need to do better so that we can hold space and do better as a people. But it's so hard. So this conversation just like gave me a lot of language today, and I'm so very grateful to be in the room with everyone. So thank you for all your honesty. Yeah, I'm gonna pick someone. How about Elizabeth?
For me, I also feel a great sense of gratitude and privilege and some revolutionary fire in myself. And I think that I often have the problem of trying to do too much too quickly and act and talk. And I think this has been a very useful opportunity for me to learn and to listen and to also increase my own capacity for understanding. And I feel a great sense of connection and empathy with everybody. And I thank you for being here to share these stories. And I'm really hopeful and thinking about ways that the conversation can continue in practical as well as kind of spiritual dimensions, so that we can continue to to pursue that sense of community and expand that sense of community for our theater and for our art community and for our country ultimately.
I will hop in, and it's kind of tying into that point. Sorry. Trying to write someone. Well, it's just me. It's a question that I want to take with myself from this talk that I'll share with the group, and hopefully it can be that small actionable step. And it kind of ties into, you know, that last bit of discussion. It's like, how can we support those early career artists who are coming up? How can we foster them? How can we support them? How can we encourage them to use their voices so they don't have to have those stories that they hold on to that may weigh them down, and those experiences that some of us on this call have had, you know, while trying to continue to create and do the work that's passionate for them. Like, how can we see them and support them and start those conversations, those one-on-one conversations, or those larger conversations, and continue to have conversations like this where we can empower people to walk away with a little bit more strength when they're kind of going out into this world. And how can we continue to like have these collaborations? And I'm really grateful to meet all of you, and thank you. And I will pass it to who looks ready, who feels, I don't know. Amee, I think you kind of like perked up a little bit.
I'm so trained to like, you know,
Ready.
to volunteer as an acting coach myself. I hate it when people just are like, you know, I don't know. But I want to say, yes, I'm empowered. This reinforces a lot of the idea that my activism doesn't have to look like your activism. Everyone's activism is personal. I really appreciate the conversation format over the panelist, you know, the things that I've been doing. I also, it was, it's just so great. I mean, I know we weren't talking as East by Southeast representatives, but I love the people that I work with and get to do this sort of conversations with. And I am so proud that we get to share that greatness and excellence with this group and with the greater Atlanta community, and so grateful that Seven Stages reached out to us. I love, by the way, the look of this associate artistic directors, this new leadership circle. Like, come on, putting your money, you know, where your mouth is. So thank you for that. And shameless plug, East by Southeast is partnering with Weird Sisters Theater Project to do to celebrate Asian excellence. In May, we'll be doing a filmed screenings of some short films by Asian American local artists. And so please be on the lookout for that. Like us on Facebook. That's where we are, East by Southeast. And also, shameless plug, I know this isn't transactional, but if you are looking to fill a diversity slot, Orange is a fantastic three-hander. I have a cast ready for you, and I'm about to age out of that role. So look into it. It's fantastic. But I'm so grateful, and I know I'll get to work with a lot of these people again. And oh yeah, is she? Oh, that's fantastic. Look at that. I didn't know that. That's so cool, Elizabeth. So I will popcorn this over to Skye.
Oh yeah. Thank you so much. You know, I get, you know, it's been fatiguing. So every time I get invited to one of these things, you know, part of me gets really anxious beforehand because they all haven't been receptive experiences, you know. But I thought this was a really important therapeutic conversation. I hope everybody learns something, and I hope that you find some way to carry that out forward. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm gonna popcorn at the.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for being here. It's you know, being with East by Southeast, like every time we have a meeting or just conversations in general, it just makes me feel so you know, relief and therapeutic, because I need these conversations. Because before all of this, I've been more of a silent partner, and I think now that I'm listening more and being more outspoken, it's helping me with my own identification and helping me to really connect with everyone. And it's very therapeutic. And being here today is just all worthwhile, because I needed all of this, because as a community, we all need these conversations and to learn from one another. Otherwise, we won't have we won't learn anything, you know. And it's just great to actually come together and, you know, have a safe space and to share together. But yeah, I really appreciate everyone's opinions and experiences and coming out and you know, being involved together. I'm pass it to Michelle.
I'm so nourished by this conversation, and to see faces I've seen before and new ones. I just want to bring our community closer and more connected. And the more that these sort of events happen, or these encounters and conversations happen, I mean, the more hope I have, um, that, you know, there's more people out there that want the same things too, and have the same kind of passion, and they're able to channel it in different ways, which only makes it grow healthier. So thank you so much to Seven Stages and to everyone on this call for joining us today, for allowing us to have a safe space to have this conversation and just to be heard. I hope to hear from you all in turn sometime too, if I didn't get a chance to today. So what a great, great Sunday. I'm going to pass it to Lauren.
Thank you, Michelle. I am really grateful for the environment and energy of this space. I think I am incredibly grateful also for just the courage and the perseverance of doing these conversations, telling your stories, retelling your stories, even though it is exhausting. I know it must be so exhausting. And I see that, and I see your courage in that, and I really appreciate it. And I have taken so many things away, but I think the most articulate thing I can say is that this idea about individual activism and not performing activism, but doing individual activism really does look totally different for every single person. And really figuring out what that path is for yourself is part of the work. And that, yeah, these institutions are made up of individuals who are going to be able to do the work. So if we can have these individual conversations and focus on the individual paths of the activism and work, then in theory, the institutions will follow. So that's all. Thank you.
I want to plug in there that I think that idea was realized with the idea group that I work with, which I know Hershey is still on this call too. A lot of great people are coming up with these kind of like revelations. And so just wanted to shout out to them, because Lauren, it did bring so much clarity to me once I understood that as well. So I'm happy to continue sharing that with everyone.
I'm going to popcorn to David.
Hi. Yeah, this space is honestly the most I've seen of AAPI like folks here out of like any space for a year, honestly. Most of my space I have been going to is yeah, BIPOC spaces in musical theater, but there was hardly anyone who identified as Asian. Mostly, yeah, like the past month, it's like I've been kind of telling myself, there's no help, but I'm gonna go to hell for this. It's mostly because of my call sign. It's what I want to do. It's what I love, and it's yeah, I love math and I love physics. I love science, but it really like amplifies the model minority trope, and it really hurts because I love the subject matter for reals. And yeah, oftentimes that has made me have hardly any Asian friends when I was younger, because I was following that. Yeah, I was the model minority, loved math all my life, was good at music all my life, and usually the other Asian kids distance away from me. But my parents were the poorest Asian family out of this community, so they want me to get out of poverty. They wanted to be the best. Sometimes, yeah, like I don't know. I'm very conflicted. Like um, I in the space that I like, the people that I tell my conflicts with, like all they could tell me is like, if you give up, white people will take your work and colonize it, and that's something I have to bear. Like it's either I'm gonna have to, yeah, stick up and unfortunately go with the minority trope and be the best that can be individually, or some white person will be the science dramaturg or musical writer. And I'll pass it on to Heidi.
I just want to make sure everybody else has the space to speak as we're closing up. Thank you, David. There's been some comments over here in the chat. Thank you so much from Caitlin, as well as SLK, I believe is what they had said to be called. So check those out. Debbie or Jeff, Sabrina, anybody else want to give a last closing statement?
Yeah, hi everyone. I just wanted to thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. It meant a lot, and one of the things that I really took away was the language building and the need to just kind of grow it so that people know how to have more productive conversations in the moment. So thank you for that and for helping me think about that more. And also just as someone who's still like in a small liberal arts college space, and obviously a lot of these things are existing for a lot of my peers within it because it's still an institutional setting, but understanding how it exists within an industry right now, and how collectively we can move forward and just be a part of contributing to a healing space. So I really, really appreciate you all. Thank you so much.
Just in the interest of time, I'll just say again, thank you for being in community with all of us. I try to typically say this is just the beginning of the next steps of keeping our feet in the fire and bridging our differences together through creativity. I know that when I landed in the hands of 7 stages, our art naturally went into the political statement. So I'm taking this conversation to continue that political activism in our vulnerability through our art. And I take your lead in making what that art is that needs to happen. Appreciate everybody's voice here. Take the time to get to know each other. I'll keep the space open for a little while longer. If you want to connect or share contact or resources, we can kind of keep it open as you also desire. Also run away and outside and stick your toes in the grass, because at some point we need to take care and know that our earth supports our growth as well as our conversation. I so appreciate everyone. Marium, is there anything else you'd like to wrap up with?
Just a very big thank you to everyone for being here today. Thank you for your vulnerability. Thank you for your courage. I hope that this conversation keeps going for ourselves, within ourselves, and with each other as we continue some of these things that we carry with us that we've learned today. Thank you. That's all. I'm just so grateful. Yeah.